Hey, Campfire crew, let's get it on. Crazy Camp Guy, submitted by Randall. My grandfather owned a large plot of land out in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska. There were a couple of ponds on the land, and we used to like to go out fishing there and ride our ATVs around. But when he passed away, he didn't sell it to my family, as none of my family really wanted it, and I was way too young to purchase it myself. He ended up selling it to another older gentleman who told us that we would have free reign on the property for our lives. And that kind of made us happy that we could still go out there, but we also didn't have to have the responsibility of taking care of the road and all of that stuff that was out there. When I say stuff, I mean a couple of shacks that sometimes people used for hunting purposes. And that's really all that was out there. One summer evening, two of my friends, I'll call Bill and Ted, and I hope everybody gets that reference, thought maybe we could go out there for a quick camping trip. I asked my dad if he thought it was okay, and he said sure. And at this point, we were all 21 years old and old enough to know that when we were on someone else's land, we needed their permission to get out there first. So we called the gentleman who owned the property, and he said, by all means go and have a good time. He also said that he would come out and see us if he could. We were super happy, got all of our stuff together, loaded up into my friend Bill's trailer with the two ATVs we were taking. And I couldn't take mine as it was in bad shape and didn't have time to fix it up. I was just going to ride bitch. Lol. So we headed out the next day and parked at the small area before the shacks, and then took our ATVs down towards the pond where we were going to pitch our tent and hang out. We did all the right things just like Boy Scouts and got a good solid fire ring together, collected a ton of firewood from the stuff that had fallen down in the forest, got it right next to the pond, and of course indulged in a few over 21 beverages. That afternoon, we spent the day doing a little fishing, but nothing was biting, so we decided to go for a ride on the ATVs. Ted stayed back for a while Bill and I zoomed around for a while, and then Bill was going to give his quad to Ted so he could have some fun. There were a lot of really fun trails out there, I will say that. So Ted took off, and Bill and I were just sitting in our camp chairs laughing and having a brew, when the gentleman who owned the land came up and said hi. We jumped up, shook hands, and said, "Hey, thanks so much for letting us stay here." And he said, "Not a problem. You guys are always welcome." He also had a beer with us and then said that he had to get going. He was going to go back up the hill and do some work on one of the shacks. After a little bit, Ted came back, and this is when things went a little weird. The gentleman who owned the land came back down the hill screaming at us that we were trespassing and to get the F off his land. Bill and I looked at each other and said, "I thought we were okay to be here." He said, "No, I have no idea who the hell you are. You're trespassing. Get your shit and get out of here." We said, okay, thinking that there was no sense in fighting this guy about it. I mean, something was seriously wrong with him. The guy stormed off up the hill. We got all our things together, packed them up, and as bummed as we were, we just made our way up the hill and saw him again. And he stopped us and said, "Hey, where are you guys going? I thought you were going to spend a couple of days out here." We all looked at each other like, what the hell? I mean, this was the same guy that had just told us to leave, and we were doing exactly as he asked. I opened my mouth and said, "Sir, you just told us that we were trespassing, and you didn't want us out here." He looked at us, and then had this look on his face like he had no idea what I was talking about, and said, "I think you're confused, son. You're more than welcome to stay here as long as you'd like." The three of us looked at each other again, and thought, okay, do we stay or do we go? We decided that we were going to stay and invited him to come down and have a steak dinner with us after we got our fire going. He said that he would like that, and that he was sorry that there was any kind of confusion. Probably not the best decision we made, but we were there and didn't want to lose any of the fun time that we knew we were going to have. For whatever reason, we thought maybe he just had a quick bout of something and then thought we were someone else. But when I say probably was not the best decision, I mean it was not the best decision. We went back down to our camp area, leaving quads on our trailer, and just got our stuff back out, set everything up again. It was getting on in the day, and we wanted to have something to eat, have a steak ready for this guy when he came back down the hill, as we knew that he would. He finally did come back down the hill, and he did enjoy a steak dinner with us, and told us all kinds of funny stories about his time in Korea, and a bunch of hunting tales that were really, really funny too. We were all having a great time, enjoying the evening around a fire and just sipping our beers. Around midnight, he said that he was going to go knock off and said that he might be leaving in the morning, but if not, he'd stop back down to chat us up again, as he said. We all stayed up around the fire until 1, and then decided to hit the sack. About an hour later, we heard a shotgun blast go off not far from our camp. And when I say not far, I mean like 10 feet away. Obviously, it woke all of us up, and we ripped the tent door open, and I looked out, and there was the guy, holding a flashlight, shining it at our tent. He started yelling and ranting like he had done earlier the day before about how we weren't supposed to be there. We were trespassing, and we needed to get the F off of his property. I spoke up and said, "Sir, you've just had a steak dinner with us and told us that we were okay to be here." He just told me to shut my effing mouth and get off his property. I just shook my head at that point and said, "Yes, sir." Repeat and repeat. He went back up the hill in the dark. We packed up our stuff again, went up the hill, and there he was again asking why we were leaving. I wanted to remind him that he just shot something off right over our tent, but I thought to myself, and looked at my friends and said, "Guys, let's just get out of here." And that's what we did. He waved at us and said we were welcome back at any time, but that was the last time I ever went out there. We drove home in the night. When I got home, my friends crashed at my place. I told my dad what had happened, and he called the guy, and the guy said that none of the things that we said happened, and that he had just been very cordial and was wondering why we left. I know there's no monsters or anything in this story or any harrowing tales of death or destruction, but I gotta be honest with you, dealing with someone who obviously was having some mental issues is scary enough. At least it was for me. I've never seen or spoken to that guy again, and I'm sure he is long since gone from this earth. Never before had I had anyone shoot anything near or towards me with a firearm, and I'm glad that he did still have the peace of mind to not shoot right at us. I wonder what might have happened had he done that. Ice Fishing Scare, submitted by Jessica. This happened to me in the mid-'80s, when my father and uncles would take me and my cousins ice fishing in British Columbia. It was a smaller lake that we would go to avoid the larger crowds, and certainly nothing like the fancy ice fishing tents that people go out in now. When I was a little kid, my grandmother would always tell us about the stick Indians, and I didn't really know what she was talking about, but she used it as a threat for us to either come into the house at night or to just go to sleep. She said that if you heard their whistling, they were coming, and they would take you away. Yeah, that's solid parenting, grandparenting. So I was 13 at the time, and my cousins were around the same age, to give or take a few years. We had ventured away from the 3 tents we had on the ice because we just got bored of sitting around listening to our dads and uncles talking and watching them drink beer. We were just fooling around and being kids and throwing chunks of ice at each other and then running around, probably bothering all the other fishermen. But we finally settled down and started to head back to our tent area that we had set up so we could have some dinner. However, my one cousin kept throwing ice chunks into the forest at the edge of the frozen lake after we had all gone back. We kept calling for him, but he just kept whipping the ice into the trees. He finally did get back to us, and we saw all the fish that my dad and uncles had caught, and they were busy making something for all of us to eat before we either went back to our trucks or stayed out to fish more. I voted to go back to my dad's pickup truck, and he had a cab on the back, and he let the heater run, and then we could just sleep through the night. My cousin also wanted to do that, but the cousin who was throwing the ice wanted to stay out with the adults. So the 2 of us went back to the truck and got snuggled in and just started talking into the night. Sometime, maybe around 1, I heard this strange whistling sound. And it wasn't like someone whistling a tune. It was this something that sounded like it was coming and going with the wind. I didn't immediately think of all the things my grandmother had told us for all of our lives. I just thought maybe it was some fisherman walking back to his truck or going out onto the ice making a really odd whistling noise. It kept up, and I could not get it out of my head. My cousin was fast asleep. This whistling was bothering me something fierce, and I won't lie. It was something that made me feel like it was trying to get me out of the truck. I mean, I know this sounds like a whole creepy pasta story, but I'm dead serious when I say it was so alluring, it was driving me insane. As I rolled back and forth, the whistling kept up for another hour or so, but by then it was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. Suddenly, there was a bang on the back of the truck, so hard that it shook the entire thing. I froze, but then heard my other cousin calling out to me to open the door to the truck. I told him to just open the cab, but he was frantic and said, "Open the door! Open the door!" So I crawled over the seat and opened the back door, and he jumped into the truck with a look of terror on his face. He took his boots off and jumped back to where we were sleeping in the cab area, waking up my other cousin, and he dove under the covers, saying how cold he was. Not long after that, my dad and uncle were all at the truck, so frantic, wondering where my cousin had gone. When they found him safe with us, they started to nicely yell at him about running away from the tent out onto the ice in the middle of the night. But he said that he'd heard this whistling that was making him feel like he needed to leave the tent and go closer to the truck in the woods. When he got to the forest edge, after he had bolted from the ice tent before anyone could stop him, he said he saw a large, hairy creature standing at the edge of the forest, in the frozen lake, not far from where our truck was. He said that this thing was the thing making the noise that he was listening to, and that it had put an arm out in the air as if to make him run towards it. He said that he actually started to run towards this strange creature, but the creature then turned and ran into the woods, and then the whistling stopped. And that's when he ran towards our truck and got inside and was safe. When he told his story, my dad and uncle looked at each other and didn't say anything, but said they were going to go get their gear, and then we were going to head home. We were supposed to stay another day, but for whatever reason, I think I know the reason, they said we needed to leave. We got home really early in the morning, and everybody wanted to go to bed. And my grandmother, who was actually staying with my mom at our house while we were gone, she heard the story, and her face went pale. She just said 2 words: "Stick Indians." My dad shot her a look as if to say, "Don't fill my kids' heads with that stuff." but it also looked like he understood what she was talking about. It wasn't until later in life that I did read up on the Stick Indians and all the things that my grandmother had said. It turns out that in our tribe, there is a legend of another tribe of large hairy creatures, also called the Stick Indians, and when they were disturbed, make a whistling noise to lure kids or other people into the woods and their unfortunate demise. But I do know that I did hear that whistle, and I do know that my cousin burst into a truck completely freaked out after he'd left the safety of my dad and uncles. So I leave it to you listeners to make what they think of my story. That happened. But now that I have kids of my own, and I still go ice fishing, I've never heard anything like that again. But I also don't tell my kids about the Stick Indians and plant things into their heads. I do look back and say that even what my grandmother had said, if it weren't for the fact that I did hear that whistling, and that my cousin also heard it, I would think I was crazy. But we're not. We did, and we're all safe. I'm just glad my cousin got back to the truck and didn't follow whatever he saw on the edge of the ice back into the woods. Dear Guy at Park, submitted by Andy J. When I was 21, I graduated from college and was still working the same job that I had before I got my degree. It was at a local campground in my area of Michigan. And it was a mix of people who had permanent places and others who would just rent for 4 weeks or so, and other people who just came and went for a couple of days. This story is about one guy who came for a couple of days, rather a weekend, but turned out to be one of the craziest people I have ever had to deal with. I'm going to call him Ed. I'm not going to share his real name, and it doesn't really make a difference if I did anyway. I'm not that kind of a dick. Ed had some serious problems, though. From the first night Ed showed up, he stopped at the main gate where I worked to admit everyone into the campground. And he looked really ragged and tired and overall pretty messed up. He didn't have a car or any other mode of transportation. He just came in with a backpack and needed a place to stay for the weekend. He had the cash, so I found a spot for him. But by the way he looked, I made sure that it was nowhere near anyone else and kind of on the edge of a forest that ran alongside the park. When I told him that's all we had, he just perked up and suddenly changed into a very happy guy, rather than the forlorn guy that came up to the office. I mean, mind you, normally there were other people that worked in the office with me, but this week in July, a lot of people were on vacation, so it was just me. I'm willing to bet, looking back on things, that if there was someone else in the office with me, they probably would have told this guy to take a hike. But I gave him a spot, gave him a map on how to get there, and let him know where he could set up his gear. The first night was fine. I went home, didn't hear anything back, and when I came into work the next day, there was still nothing that jumped out at anyone, despite the fact that this guy looked like he had just jumped off a train after robbing a bank somewhere in the Midwest. He was totally sketch. Long hair, really weird beard that wasn't fully grown in the right places, and quite frankly, he did kind of stink. The second night, I got a visit from one of our year-long residents. She said she'd been walking her dog along the road where this Ed guy was staying, and she said that he was acting very strangely. He ran out at her dog with a knife and fork and said, "Are you what's for dinner?" At first, she thought it was a joke, but then he just stood there looking at her and her dog and said it again. Not wanting to cause an issue, she simply told him that he was a jerk and went back to her trailer. She also said over her shoulder that she was going to file a complaint with the office, which happened to be me. As I mentioned, a lot of people were out, including my boss. I told her I'd go over and talk to him and tell him not to harass anyone, and if it happened again, he would be out of here. She thanked me and took off. Before I could get my golf cart and go out and talk to Ed, another person came over and said that she'd been seeing him stalking around their site the night before. And when they asked him to leave, he just started to do this weird dance, and said that there was salvation in God, whatever God they wanted to believe in. When they asked him to leave, he just stood there and kept saying the same thing over and over. You will be saved. You will be saved whether you like it or not. Finally, one of the guys at the site stepped over to him. He finally backed off and then ran away into the dark. So I figured, okay, I'm going to close the office for a few minutes and drive out on my golf cart to talk to Ed and tell him that it was probably time for him to leave. Unfortunately, this was around 9 in the evening, and we had a huge influx of people that needed campsites, and I had to spend time taking care of all of them. And I kind of forgot all about Ed. Later, around 10, I was getting ready to shut everything down as we always did at 10. And up the road came Ed. As I said, I've completely forgotten about him, but now when I saw him, I remembered, oh man, I needed to tell him that he probably should move on. He already was ready to move on, but what bothered me more than anything was his shorts and the lower part of his shirt were covered with blood. I asked him if he was okay, and he had this really creepy grin on his face and said, I'm fine. Thanks for letting me stay here. I hope I can come back. And then he just walked down the road. He went out the gate and down the road. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I didn't even say anything to him. I mean, he paid. He'd been weird. He was kind of harassing other people. But what the hell was I going to say about the blood on his shorts and shirt? So I waved at him as he walked away and got onto my golf cart to go make sure that everything was okay at the campsite that he'd been at. And remember, this is in the night. It was pitch black out by this time. I had my mag light with me, and it was never usual that a customer left at that time of night. I mean, most of them usually left during the day or in the morning. So my spidey sense was a little high that something was very, very wrong. I got to his site, and as I mentioned, it was a little bit away from everybody else because I knew this guy was just a little weird. When I got there, everything seemed pretty tidy. There wasn't an issue with anything that I knew that I would have to complain about. But there was something that caught my attention at the very edge of the forest, right behind the site. I saw a hoof of a deer. I mean, it was just laying there, and I thought, that's odd, especially since deer don't normally lay like that, and if I had come up on it, one would normally just gotten up and run away. When I got closer, I realized that it was dead. I also noticed that it had its throat cut. I'm an avid hunter, and I've had to do a lot of things to finish off game, but this was so messed up. It looked like it had its throat sawn open with some kind of serrated blade, and I also noted that its backside was completely bloody and also looked like it had been sawn open. There was blood all over the place and all over the backside of the deer. It then hit me about the blood on Ed's shorts and his t-shirt. The light bulb went off, and I realized what actually happened here. I can't say for sure because I wasn't there, but I will bet anyone $100 that Ed did what he did to that deer, and then did what he had to do to that deer's rear. Sorry for that cheesy pun. I just got back on my golf cart, went back to the office and called the police and let them know they needed to call the game warden to come out and get this deer, but I also told them about Ed. They said they would be on the lookout for him and send out a couple of cars to go up and down the main road looking for him. I also called my boss, who asked me to stay on a little bit later to handle all of the issues that we had to do with the dead animals when we had them. I said okay. When they did get out there, which I figured they would wait until the next day, but they didn't, they said there was evidence of penetration of the animal, but they did say it looked like the substances of semens were also on the animal's fur. They never did find the guy, and I just let it go because there was nothing much more I could do. My boss gave me a couple of days off, and the police never returned to talk to me about Ed again. And I like that job so much, but that is by far the most screwed up thing that I've ever had to deal with. I'm still an avid camper and hunter, along with my family, and every time I pitch a tent for my wife and kids, and we're right up against the woods, I think about Ed and the crazy thing that I know he did. I know in my heart of hearts that that guy killed a deer and then had sex with it. I guess it takes all kinds to make the world go round, but I hope I never see that guy again. Thanks if you share this, Uncle Josh. Sasquatch on Camping Trip, submitted by Tucker P. Hey, former Western New York native here, Uncle Josh. I know that you'll know exactly where I'm talking about when I tell you about this story of something that happened to me in the mid-'80s while camping with my family. There's a large state park called Allegheny State Park in the southern tier of Western New York. Part of it also runs into Pennsylvania, but it's obviously a different park. We were a tent camping family in the 80s as it was economical and a lot of fun. We could fish during the day, have campfires at night, and even run to a number of roadside attractions if we wanted to. Back then, there was a serious issue with the raccoon population, and as far as I know, it's still running rampant today. If my memory serves me correctly, they actually brought in hunters to thin out the numbers of the raccoons. They were that bad. Of course, there's a lot of other animals out there, including black bears and all kinds of stuff, but the raccoons were a complete pain in the butt. One year, as I mentioned, we were there camping for about a week. And the raccoons, of course, were coming on in full force every night, trying to get into everything, including our tents. If you've never had to deal with raccoons that have dealt with humans, you'll find that they're unbelievably industrious and creative in the ways that they get in and out of any number of things, including coolers, vehicles, you name it. We would stay up around the fire at night and see the eyes at the edge of the fire, and then during the day we would collect rocks to chuck at them to get them to take off. It didn't really matter, because they would just come back after we put the fire out and went to bed. We could hear them rummaging around for anything they could get their little dirty paws on. One night we decided to stay for an extra night, so a lot of the people who had been next to us in the area that we'd been camping with had taken off and no one had filled their spots. Which is pretty rare, because it's a very popular park, and getting a campsite there back then was not the easiest thing to do. I mean, you literally had to start looking for them in the winter. But I digress, that's not the point of the story. We decided to stay an extra night, and we were up having one last campfire and enjoying our conversation, me, my two sisters, my mom, and my dad. Of course, my dad and I had our pile of rocks on hand, and of course the raccoons showed up not too long after it got really dark. But something strange happened. After we started to see their beady little eyes, everything got completely quiet, and I mean dead quiet. There were also a couple of great horned owls way up above us that would hover around our campsite. We could see them, but even they were quiet and gone. All of a sudden, all the eyes were gone, and there was nothing other than the crackling of the fire. And that's when we heard something walking in the woods right behind my pup tent. Now, my pup tent was up a little bit on a hill away from the tent where my parents and sisters were sleeping, and I was always up there with my dog. But even our dog was silent during this, but very attentive. I was watching him scan as best he could the edge of the forest behind us. He heard what was there. There was something out there, and it was big. My dad slowly started to get out of his old rickety lawn chair. Remember those ones that were just like ribbons that kept the frame together? God, I'm old. But even he thought something was up as we listened to whatever this thing was walk through the trees right behind my tent. My dad at first thought maybe it was just another camper that was lost, so he called out, "Hey, everything okay? Do you need any help?" There was no answer, and the footsteps that we heard crunching stopped. Everything was dead silent, and my mother had a concerned look on her face. She was probably more worried about us kids than anything else. But then we heard this unbelievably loud roar/scream. It's hard to describe. It was kind of a combination of both. I've listened to so many documentaries and seen all of the fictional movies about Bigfoot like Boggy Creek and The Legend of Sasquatch, but it was nothing like that. It was a mix, and again, I'm sorry, I really can't describe it. But it was as loud as all get out, and we could hear the scurrying of the other animals that maybe were in hiding near our campsite. I mean, they were all taking off. We sat dumbfounded looking at one another, and I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty sure all of us were a little bit scared at that point. Didn't sound like a man or a woman screaming, and it didn't sound like a bear growling or roaring. It sounded like a very large beast. After that, it was silence again, and we heard the footsteps continue to move away from our campsite. My dad said, "All right, that's it. Everybody in the tent, including you," as he pointed at me, "you're not sleeping in your pup tent tonight." He was going to stay out by the fire and did allow me to stay out for a little while longer with him before telling me that I needed to go with the rest of the family. I mean, I was only about 10 at the time. So later that night, my dad let the fire burn down and eventually came into the tent with us. We all fell asleep until something woke my dad and me up. My mom and sisters were totally out. We heard something fiddling with the back of our station wagon. My dad slowly got up and grabbed his flashlight. And the first thing I thought was maybe this was some person trying to rob us or take something out of the station wagon. My dad saw that I was getting up and said to stay put, as he realized that I was awake, but of course I was going to follow him towards the edge of the tent while he unzipped the door. He did and pointed the flashlight at the back of our station wagon, and what we saw will forever be ingrained in my mind. We only saw the back of whatever this thing was for the most part. And I know I've referred to it as a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it. I believe in that area they sometimes refer to it as Hi-Hat. But anyway, this thing was towering over the back of our station wagon. I mean, at least 2 or 3 feet taller. And that includes the gate of the station wagon being open. This thing was oblivious to us until it saw the light of the flashlight. We realized it was going through one of our coolers. But when it saw the light, it turned and, without much of a sound, ran off into the forest behind us. But at that point, the footsteps were extremely loud. I mean, this thing was huge. We never really got a good look at its face. My dad, as brave as he is, ran to the car, closed the gate, locked everything up, ran back to our tent, and then again, noticing that I was up, said, "Go back to bed." He went back outside and sat out in his rickety lawn chair next to the car with his flashlight in an attempt to protect us if anything did come back. Nothing did, but the next day we did find out that whatever this thing was, which I continue to refer to as Sasquatch or Bigfoot, had gone through an entire cooler of food and opened up a brand new pickle jar. Some new cheese had been bitten in half, and no bother with the wrapper there, big guy, and some milk had been drank and spilled all over the back of the station wagon. We just packed up that morning without saying much, other than how crazy and scary everything was. But my dad and I didn't want to scare my mom or my sisters. We kept most of what we had seen to ourselves, and just told them that someone had broken into the car. When we were leaving, my dad told one of the park rangers what we had seen, and the guy just kind of nodded and said in an offhand way, "Yeah, you're not the first people to ever say that kind of thing." He didn't really believe us, I could tell. But he gave us that feeling that other people had seen something or had mentioned something to him over the years that worked there. I looked into a lot of reports online, and I've never seen anything specifically in Allegheny State Park. But there are lots of reports of people seeing a large, hairy, bipedal creature in that region. And lots of people don't believe in this sort of thing and think that I'm pulling their leg when I tell them this story. But I saw what I saw. My dad saw what he saw. So we both saw what we saw. He's now in his 80s, and every once in a while we'll bring it up at a family gathering, and my mom finally found out the truth of what happened a few years back, and was very angry that we had never told her the straight story. My sisters thought we were just pulling their leg when we told them, but the look on my dad's face when he did say what we saw made them believe that for whatever reason on that summer night, a large creature decided to pay my family a visit. At least it scared off the raccoons. Thanks for reading my story if you do. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any scary story of any nature that you would like to hear narrated on my channel, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. For the Bigfoot story, I'm very familiar with Allegheny State Park. I used to camp there myself. And when I was racing mountain bikes, I trained there all the time. There's actually a race there called the Raccoon Rally. I think it's back up and running. I haven't been racing my mountain bike in many, many years. But even when I was there in the 80s, as you just mentioned, before we got a permanent place someplace else, my family would camp there, and the raccoons were a complete pain in the ass. And as far as I know, they still are to this day. Raccoons are kind of a pain in the ass. Anyway, thanks for sending that in, and thanks for everyone for submitting their stories. I look forward to everyone else who wants to submit their stories, and again, I read them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the notification button to know every time that I upload. And follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. Everyone, enjoy the summer, and as always, be excellent to each other. Until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.